conference to be here with us today. So this is Dr. Linda Alvarez. Dr. Linda Alvarez received her PhD in political science as well as a Master's of Arts in International Relations from Claremont Graduate University. She also holds a Master's of Art in Latin American Studies in California from California State University, Los Angeles. And her scholarly interests revolve around exploring ways in which the underrepresented and marginalized groups interact. As a political scientist, she works within the frameworks of comparative political behavior, political psychology, and transnational migration, social movements, race, political ethics, food politics, and the study of violence and trauma. So she is currently at California State Northridge, I believe. Is it Northridge? Yes. And so she will be coming today to talk to us about cultural aspects of consuming meat. And so, Linda, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello. Let me just put this here. So I am coming from Chicago by way of Los Angeles, so I thank you for accepting me in this different weather pattern. It's been a unique experience, that's for sure. I was telling someone earlier that in Los Angeles, if it gets anywhere near 75, we feel like we're going to die. So so definitely different. I am hoping you all will be okay with no PowerPoint. I thought I'd go super old school and just talk. So I will be discussing more of the social, political aspects of food and colonization, and take that as my point of departure here. So I'll start off with the conquest, and the area that I'm focusing on is Mesoamerica. A lot of my work deals with Central America in general, so these areas between Mexico extending through Honduras, maybe a little further, Costa Rica areas, or what is now those areas. So the conquest, as you all may be familiar with, it was an extremely violent phase in human history that had a military component, also had economic components, political components, et cetera. And one of these pieces in which I like to look at the power aspect is in food, and the way food played such an enormous role in the process of colonization. Part of the colonization process not only included the colonization of other human beings through extremely violent means, but also the colonization of the flora and the fauna of the New World as well. So with Mesoamerica, we know that food in this region was heavily, initially, very plant-based. So it's not to say that, agriculturally speaking, I'm not saying that there was no meat consumption or consumption of animals, but primarily it was plant-based. The agricultural structures and the production systems were some of the most advanced in the region, with processes like the Chinampa system, which are the floating gardens that you may be familiar with in Mexico, Tenochtitlan, those areas. Some in Guatemala, they had terrace gardening, individual plots of garden, right? Garden plots. The basic staple was maize, the principal staple. But there are a lot of other different types of plant-based foods were grown, including as the three sisters, right? The very common, so the maize, the corn, and the the maize, the beans, and the squash. It also included crops like chiles, chili, right? Avocado, elderberries, guava, tomatoes, tobacco, cotton, chocolate was a big thing as well. And these systems were very, there was also a lot of political use of food as well. So chocolate is one of those food products that was actually used for a while as currency. So there was a lot of attachment of social and political structures also to the food systems that existed. So one of the, the main points of departure is always to consider the conquest a very contested process. A lot of the times it's framed as this event that occurred in which indigenous people were taken over completely, and it was terrible, and it really sucked, and that's it. But it's a lot of resistance, right, and a lot of contestation to the process of colonization. And a lot of that, deals with literally completely altering the food systems and the political and social ways in which people used to live. So, in terms of meat, very briefly, there is evidence that white-tailed deer in this region was heavily consumed, possibly even domesticated. Dog, turkey, some forms of duck, iguana, depending on if you were in the coastal areas, some fish. So it wasn't that these diets were completely devoid of meat, but definitely more heavily plant-based. When the conquest occurs, it was actually Columbus's second voyage in 1493 in which he started really altering, or where the conquest and colonizers in general started really altering the food systems. Columbus's motivation for bringing over different types of food is because he literally believed that the Spanish were withering away and were dying because there was no food for them to eat. And so he petitioned the crown and started talking about, everyone's dying, so we're going to need to get something else because they can't eat the foods that are available. There is no food in Mesoamerica, so we need to bring our own foods. And that's where we see the introduction of cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, goats, and of course horses. And horses played a huge part in the actual violent process of colonization as well, the military process. And so with them, they also brought not only the animals, but other types of foods, right? The invasion, we can say, of non-native foods as well. So including things like wheat being a huge one, chickpeas, melons, onions, radishes, grapes, sugar cane, fruit stones, olives, these kinds of things. And it was very important for them to introduce these foods because the composition of oil, wheat and bread, olive oil, right? Wheat, so bread and grapes, wine was considered a civilized diet. So the tenets of having civilized food. And other plants hitchhiked their way over with the voyages of the Spanish, including some types of grasses, clovers, right, dandelions, and then other special friends like the mosquitoes and the cockroaches and rats and bees. And bees are something that's talked about a lot, but bees played a huge role in colonization because they were so great at their jobs that they heavily propagated the non-natives. So bees are often not discussed, but they played a huge role in that process. Indigenous people in Mesoamerica did not initially take the opportunity, actually were resistant to food. There's been some very well documented resistance efforts against colonial foods where, you'll see riots or things where they intentionally just targeted seeds. And so they found the seeds of European crops and intended to burn them all and destroy them as a process of resistance to colonization. So they did not take the opportunity to cultivate old world foods, right? Heavy quotes on the old world. But to cultivate these kind of old world foods, they were forced to raise them, however, in order to make tribute payments. And so there began the process of indigenous cultivation of these so-called old world foods, right? The foods that were brought over via colonization. Now, an exception to that is going to be the consumption of beef and the consumption of meat. So I want to talk a little bit about how this process works. Columbus arrives these animals, right? Other colonizers around the area are arriving with also cows, pigs, chickens. And when they arrive, they have little to no predators. So no natural predators here in Mesoamerica. Little to no diseases. And so they're literally free and set free to just feed on whatever as far as the eye can see. And so they begin grazing and feeding on the grasses, the roots, the wild fruits, and most devastatingly on indigenous plots and gardens. And so as they do this, there begins almost the forced disappearance of indigenous foods and the forced shift in food consumption. Pigs actually adapted the quickest in Mesoamerica and actually in all of the places that the Spanish were around. To give you an example, a little bit later in the 1500s, De Soto shows up in Florida, and he originally arrived with 13 pigs. And 3 years later, there were 700 pigs in the area. So there was a lot of, they were reproducing quite quickly. They did well in the environment. They were so successful, the pigs, that colonizers actually stocked islands that they didn't intend to immediately colonize. They just left pigs in certain areas. They knew they'd reproduce so that when they came back, they would have a food source. The multiplication of cattle was just as spectacular as the pigs. When they arrived, again, free to graze wherever they wanted to, they ground Mesoamerican vegetation between their teeth, preventing the regrowth of native shrubs and trees. Their hooves transferred foreign grasses, which choked out native vegetation. And actually, by the 17th century, there were more cattle in the New World than any other type of vertebrate animal. Vertebrate immigrant. So much cattle was actually being consumed that actually the meat was not necessarily the first and foremost thing that was sought after. It was actually the hides and the tallow that people were trading and making a lot of money off of. And so this led to very low meat prices for cow, right, for cattle. In the 1560s, actually a little bit later, there was more meat consumed in 1 day in Mesoamerica and in these regions than in 10 days in Spain. And so there is the process of the Spanish, right, and the Spanish that did come over and colonize, also a lot of them were poor. And so with the arrival here, the availability of meat was a shock to them, right? Because there were shortages in Europe that they were dealing with. So they come here. There's a lot of now cow available, beef available. And so it was so abundant and so cheap at some point because of the huge explosion of cattle in this region that at times it was practically free and often left to rot after butchering because there was just so much of it. Further south a little bit in the area that's now South America, cows were killed daily, hung from corral posts so that workers could just come by and cut away meat as they wanted to, and just left out in public because there was just so much of it. Now, going back to the indigenous people, these civilizations mostly lived on a vegetable-based diet, so that anything that radically affected croplands radically affected their way of life. Things got so bad in terms of cattle encroachment on actual lands and food production, indigenous food production, that the Spanish even began to take note, and the Spain's new first viceroy actually wrote to the king about it and stated, "May your lordship realize that if cattle are allowed, the Indians will be destroyed." So it was truly a devastating process. With little to no choices, meat consumption began to increase among indigenous people in this area, but this is only after traditional plots and traditional food systems were destroyed, and in fact, indigenous people were literally starved to death via this process. The other really important piece here in terms of food and when considering colonization and power is that socialization played a huge role in this as well. So it wasn't just the physical, actual cows and, encroaching on certain areas. It was also a deliberate plan to change the mentality around food and to change the mentality around what people ate and what was considered good food versus bad food, and the right foods versus the wrong foods. And so this socialization was based on the idea of humorism brought over from the Europeans. And here, the idea was that literally you are what you eat. And so what you ate determined your composition, and it determined who you were. So the physical differences that separated, according to them, the Europeans from the indigenous people was more a function of food than of anything else in this perspective. The rhetoric was that of indigenous foods being famine foods. They should only be eaten if you're literally starving to death. Otherwise, there was no need to eat those foods. In fact, these foods were degrading to European bodies. And because they believed that you are what you eat, the danger was always there that if you ate indigenous foods, you would turn into an indigenous person, and you would then degrade who you are by doing so, right? So the role or the goal of this aspect of colonization was to switch the model and to socialize people to believe that European foods were the good foods, right? And that European foods were what you should be eating if you want to be a good, solid, healthy, civilized human. And some of the ideas around this are so interesting. In the comparison of male bodies, so male European bodies to indigenous bodies, there's some record of the notion of body hair. And so they said, well, the men here don't even have body hair. It must be because they eat differently. They're not real men because of the lack of body hair. So they were confused about the lack of beards and why they didn't have beards, and it must be because they don't eat the same way Europeans eat. So interesting ideas here. But to give you an idea of the inculcation that was taking place, you know that religion was a huge part of the colonization process, and in this area, the Catholic religion was imposed as fiercely as the violence was part of the violence actually in this area. And so one of the first sermons to indigenous people heavily incorporated this idea of food, and I'll read you a piece of it so you can get an idea. Now, this is going to be sermons in which people, this is church, and everything that happens at church is correct. So Amerindians should emulate European consumption practices. This is the friar giving his sermon to an indigenous congregation. Specifically, they should eat that which Castilian people eat because it is good food. Raise Castilian maize, in other words, wheat. So he didn't mean traditional maize, he meant wheat. So that you may eat Castilian tortillas. Raise sheep, pigs, cattle for their flesh. Raise sheep, pigs, and cattle, for their flesh is good. May you not eat the flesh of dogs, mice, skunks, for it is not edible. You will not eat what the Castilian people do not eat, for they know well what is edible. So again, propagating this idea of what is correct food, what these right foods are versus the wrong foods. And so if indigenous food was degrading, then Europeans preached that their food was ultimately salvation, right? And through this process, Europeans, indigenous people, could then become like the European. The belief also existed that as indigenous people ate more European foods, they would acquire a European complexion, which was also part of the socialization process to detach from the idea of the indigenous and to move away from that as much as possible, transform their bodies. And so some of this socialization comes through as, you know, when we look at the notion of cattle and people started eating, indigenous people started eating more beef, their status increased. They were considering that their status was increasing. Society considered if you eat meat, you have a higher social status than eating these famine foods. And if you were an indigenous person who could get a hold of cattle or have some ownership of cattle, then your status was increased as well. Interestingly, there are a number of writings that point to the consumption of meat and the increased demise of indigenous people. And so Europeans at this time, the Spanish were writing, there's a chunk of time in which they're really concerned about how indigenous people are dying because of the increased beef consumption. And the letters are indicating, you know, we're seeing that there's a problem. Seems like they can't process meat very well. It seems like every time they eat meat, they're dying. We don't know what's happening. And so these very letters that they're penning to each other and to the crown is, you know, very concerned about the fact that indigenous people are withering away. They seem malnourished and they're dying because they're eating European foods and they're eating a lot of meat. But it was reasoned away as indigenous should adopt a European diet, even though doing so might kill them. But they should still try to adopt this diet because then they will become civilized. As time goes on, the demand for cereals begins to push, for cereals, right? So for cropland begins to push cattle into peripheral areas. And so patterns begin to change. Croplands become more important than letting cattle just run freely everywhere. So there's a bit of constraining of the cattle. And so many regions begin to change from livestock to actual cereal production. And in this time period, the price of beef rises. And then again, so now we have it flips again, where beef becomes inaccessible now to the poor, to indigenous people. And so there's a bit of a return to only traditional food, so beans, tortillas. Now, I want to be clear that it's not that these foods ever disappeared, right? The traditional foods of indigenous people did not disappear. It's just that the intrusion, I would say, or the introduction of cattle had a big effect on not just the way food was grown, but also what they ate over time. So this becomes a very interesting piece here because as this idea about beef comes and goes, we see that what has remained consistent is the tying of status to what you eat. And so a lot of the work that I do deals with Central America, deals with migrants now. But if you look at Central America, from the time of colonization, the introduction of beef, it is consistently tied to violent processes. And so even now, as we have, you know, with the rise, you know, much later after what I've talked about here, we have the rise of agro-export production in Central America, and beef being one of the huge pieces here. Currently, you know, the introduction of beef and beef being raised in Central America has led to deforestation and has led to a lot of problems with indigenous territories and indigenous lands, which are consistently usurped in order to grow, you know, to have lands to be able to have for cattle to graze and, you know, for export. In Honduras right now, there are, and in Nicaragua, there are two different areas which are dealing with literal murder, I would say, right? Violence between communities as indigenous people try to fight to maintain their land titles and the encroachment of beef again. Another piece that I very briefly want to mention, because I'm not sure how much time I have left, but is the idea, again, about migration here, and so tying it back to the status, the meat and the status. trying to think how to phrase this. The idea that, again, beef means that you've made it, and beef means that you've achieved a status that is acceptable in society. I've been doing work with slaughterhouse workers who are of Guatemalan descent and indigenous. They're mostly Ixil, and so even Spanish is their second language. And in talking to them, they're coming from areas where there's extreme poverty. And so I was speaking to one of the fathers who had to leave Guatemala because his son was being harassed by a local gang, and it's very common in Central America, and so people leave because of the violence. And so he's leaving, he takes his son, and then he's talking to me about life now in the United States. He works in the slaughterhouse, and his son is going to be joining him very soon to work in the slaughterhouse. And he's saying, I asked him, well, how do you feel about life now here? What's different? How are you adapting now that you're here? And he said, well, in Guatemala, all we had to eat was tortillas and beans. Sometimes we only ate tortillas and some salt, and that's all we had access to. But now that we're here, we had never had soda before, and we had never had Burger King. So we lived down the street from a Burger King, and so my son doesn't want to eat anything else, actually. So now that we're here, we really feel like, wow, our life has really changed and we've made it, because all we eat every day is soda and Burger King. And that's what they had been eating for the last couple of months since they had arrived. And so I was like, no, but not soda. But it gives you an idea, and this is, it's a common thread, right? The idea that if you have access to meat, you have somehow made it. Especially, I'm speaking to migrant communities now, and from these areas. And meat is still very expensive in these areas. So you've somehow achieved a different status if you're able to include them into your diet, versus not being able to, right? And so some of the traditional foods, which we know have existed forever and remain very healthy and were staples at one time, have been also degraded in this process to think of as that's not food that you would eat if you had achieved something in your life, right? So that's a huge piece to work on in these communities. And I did want to speak a little bit to, there was a question on food and growing your own food and low-income people and these kinds of things. And this ties into that as well, because in some of the, related to this project that I've done with slaughterhouse workers is the project of, I'm working with farm workers in Southern California. And in terms of growing your own food, I also work on a project that tries to get low-income people to grow their own food and regain autonomy through growing their own food and agency. So tying this idea back to the fact that these foods were traditionally grown by our people forever, and so there's no reason that we should play into this concept that they're degraded or not acceptable. But the idea exists here too, even in growing your own food, in that we have some school programs where we've got kids growing, a lot of food and community gardens and school gardens, and some of the parents are really concerned because some of the kids are really taking an interest in it and can be channeled into some more big agricultural products, processes and programs, and the parents are saying, we don't want our kids to be farmers. We don't want our kids to participate in growing food because that's what we've been doing. And so they're farm workers, and as farm workers, they're heavily exploited in this country, and so they don't see that as a future for their children. So that, again, ties back to this historical idea, right, and the idea of food and status and what you should and shouldn't do, regardless of the fact that these foods can have a very significant role and can even change the way and the accessibility to to the foods that people today have, which are so deficient in low-income communities of color specifically. So I think I'll stop there. I actually probably will be leaving to catch a plane back to Chicago, so I wanted to leave a couple of minutes in case anybody had any questions before I leave, since I won't be here, but I'll end there. Thank you. Sure. I don't think so.
So you talked about how eventually meat became inaccessible. How did that happen exactly?
So this is related to the cropland. So as more land is allocated to cereal production, then less is allocated to livestock, and so that changes the prices of accessibility, but also changes the prices of meat. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
In what ways do you still see food sort of weaponized throughout the world?
Oh man, we could have another entire conference on that. So many ways. I think in urban, if we're talking about urban areas, just the food that's accessible. Accessibility is a huge way of weaponizing, even through its through the lack of accessibility, food, right? And so. Just to give you an example, literally close to home, in the area that I live in, Los Angeles, it's a low-income Latino neighborhood, Latino and Filipino mostly, and we don't have. We have one sort of a grocery store, and then the rest is, we have everything else, like Burger King, Carl's Jr. I mean, every fast food joint you can think of is on every single corner. And so they even tried to do a farmer's market there for a second, and then even the vegetables were not great looking. For California, I was like, come on, we can do better than this. Everything's here. So, but it was just a foreign concept, kind of like, well, what is this? Versus all these other types of food that are available. So, but that's one way, right? Food accessibility. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the whole food deserts issue and the problem with accessibility to food. But also, the fact that this idea still heavily remains, right? I know that the speakers coming after me are going to talk more about indigenous issues and indigenous foods, but if you think right now, right, how many foods can you name that are like indigenous foods, right? It's like that, okay, oh, today I ate, let me see what I ate that was like of native descent, indigenous, real like foods. So much of that has been lost, even the history of it, the idea of it, even among our people themselves, right, where they've lost the tradition of eating these types of foods because they're associated to political and social statuses. But there's a lot there. Maybe next year that'll be the conference. Yeah. Yes. Not that I've heard of. I just recently heard of a tiny bit of that amongst maybe the Zapatista community, like in Mexico, but Central America is one huge site of production, and that's all it's that's been really the policy towards Central America. So I have not heard of anything in terms of sustainability. There's some more sustainability movements like Via Campesina, something you may want to look into in terms of food production and sustainability and more cooperative type of movements around food. But in terms of sustainability of meat, no, not at all. Not that I've heard of, yeah. Yes.
Colonization went both ways. What about the tomato and the potato from the New World going to Europe?
Yeah.
And the other thing is that a lot of the indigenous people mainly died from smallpox that came from Europe.
Yeah, European diseases played a huge role in eradication of indigenous people. But that was part of the process, right? So that, I mean, I'm not sure what your question is if it's that, did that kill off more people than the lack of food, or what exactly is your?
Well, I've always heard that smallpox killed more indigenous people than any other cause of death.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, disease was a huge part of that, but that's not to say that these other things are not pertinent or are not part of that actually, I should say, need to be part of the larger conversation, right? Because there's a lot of myths still that persist about colonization and what occurred. But you wanted to say something to that?
I think smallpox was a second cultural genocide. Over 50 million natives were killed through what she was talking about, through conquering. So smallpox played a very small part compared to the cultural genocide.
Yeah, and it's going to be, I mean, just look at even bison, right, in the north, and how that played out, this literal starvation of communities. So it's not to say that disease didn't play a huge role, because it did, but definitely this cultural component, this political, this power component, as people who are interested in food, needs to be incorporated into our discourse, no doubt, for sure. And the tomato, yeah, it made its way over there, but I'm not aware of any necessarily violent processes associated with that.
I guess the confusion was that you were mentioning that the indigenous people were dying because they were eating cow.
Well, this was the idea of the Europeans themselves, right, who were documenting in their idea that indigenous people, it seemed like their consumption of meat was causing huge problems. And so the letters that they're writing back, right, and the documentation we're talking about very early on, so we don't have emails and all that stuff to necessarily corroborate a lot of this, but the documentation that exists speaks to their concern, literal, with indigenous people being affected by their consumption of meat, right? There's other things that we can point to too, in terms of dairy, right, and the introduction of milk and how that affected indigenous communities severely as well, and continues to do so, right? The idea of being lactose intolerant and those things. But in these writings, it very much points to the fact that there was a concern among Europeans that indigenous people were not doing well with the consumption of beef. Mm-hmm.
The lack of sanitary conditions, so maybe some of those secondary deaths that were tied to the eating the meat were actually like salmonella and E. coli and things that were meat production and sanitary cooking or chopping them up.
Yeah, yeah, we can imagine the processes were much different then as well. No USDA around. Yeah. Any other questions? I think I see one. Yes.
To what extent did colonizers also destroy seed stores of indigenous people?
Yeah, so that's an interesting component. There were some areas where there was a little bit more cooperation because the climates were really inhospitable to European foods, and so there, in those areas, there's some evidence of helping to grow or deferring to native populations to grow foods and helping in the kind of I don't know that it's conservation, but assisting with that.
Did they destroy seed stores?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did they destroy? Not as an act of resistance. I'm not, what I'm aware of is in terms of the indigenous as an act of resistance destroying these foods, but I'm not in that political sense. I think it was just in terms of a power component here and literally just replacing one with the other, but going to intentionally destroy, no. And speaking to the point earlier that it does go the other way too, right? It's not that it was complete only European foods. They did incorporate over time also indigenous foods, so the avocado and all kinds of other, chocolate being a huge thing that Europeans were really into. Coffee, right? Other products were definitely incorporated. So yeah. Anything else? Okay, so I don't know if I'm. Oh, okay, there. Yes. Okay, this is the last question.
I was curious about these parents who are concerned about their children taking an interest in growing food. I was wondering if there are other career prospects for them other than becoming farm laborers, ones that their parents might respect more that get them more income that are involved in food production, or in other ways taking an interest in food production could help them have more independence from, like maybe if they grow their own food at home, they would have less reliance on the income of a farm laborer, possibly, or if there are other ways that they can have independence and more control through taking an interest in food production.
So this is there's I think a lot of students here, so I would encourage anybody who's interested in this to start doing some more work on it, because it is I think understudied. But I have a colleague who works on, it's not even necessarily food. They have a farm on the school, but it's also mostly flower production. So for like weddings and roses and these kinds of things. And the parents are still little, it's still the same idea, is that the kids are going to go into some type of agricultural and in California, I'm not sure about here, but in California you can make a lot of money. A lot of money in floral production, and so it's still problematic because it's attached to these other ideas. But I always wonder where the farm workers themselves are, why they aren't growing mass amounts of food for themselves and starting cooperatives and starting these kinds of things, right? If anybody is an expert on growing food, it would be migrant farm workers. And so this plays into the political piece as well, right? But those are things that definitely need to be looked into more. And understood to be able to maybe shift the narrative and create more opportunities for kids who want to go into it, and even for the parents, right, to use their expertise to do something else to increase their own agency and their own productivity for themselves rather than for someone else. All righty, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That was a fascinating look at the history of meat consumption, something we generally don't get in our history books. Our next speaker is Stephen Bond, and Stephen Bond, who hails from Oklahoma. Don't tell you that? Yeah, it's another minority group. Steve got his undergraduate degrees in Oklahoma in biology and environmental chemistry. And then he went on to study ecology, but apparently had a change of heart sometime during that study and changed to get a Master's of Science in Environmental, a Master of Science in Environmental Science with a specialty in watershed resource management. In 2008, he began working for the Chickasaw Nation, where he is an enrolled member. He then formed the Ecological Resource Sustainability Program. In 2011, he began working with the Intertribal Agricultural Council, providing technical assistance to tribes in Utah and Arizona, and serving as a liaison with the USDA. There's USDA again. They're everywhere. In 2013, though, he returned to his farm in Stratford, Oklahoma, working in the eastern Oklahoma region, and I was very heartened to hear that Steve is a fellow paddler, canoeer, so that was makes you several notches up in my book, Steve, but I'm sure. So Steve is going to talk about meat, traditional versus ancestral. So Stephen Bond.
I just bought a Grumman canoe. It's like heavy on my mind, a sport boat. And I love it. It's much more interesting to talk about than, no, I'm kidding. We won't deter. So I'm going to stand over here, kind of on this angle. So following up the talk, and I'm already awful with names. If it's scientific or if it's Latin or Greek, I tend to not forget, but anything else. So Linda's talk is completely altered what I was going to talk about. We'll just say that. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about a story where as Hernando de Soto was heading westward, he encountered my folks on the Mississippi River. So somewhere around modern day Memphis. And when that happened, the Chickasaws had they knew they were coming. You know, there was Hernando de Soto's group writes about this in detail, so y'all can go back and look up the data, or look up the annotations, and for most of that section of history, we didn't have a written language, so you're going to have to go back and just kind of like interpret the European notes on what happened within the tribe, and just know they were racist. They were very biased when they were writing down these notes. And it's it like reads very angry, racist. Or some ancient variation of the theme, so as Hernando de Soto had engaged the Chickasaws on the east side of the river, the Chickasaws just bailed. We just was like, you can have that village. We got others. And so Hernando de Soto writes about the volume of corn and the corn production, and he was able to feed his 300 folks and all the horses and the cows and the pigs that he was dragging around in his entourage. And midwinter, we had been negotiating with Hernando de Soto. And let me just add this note, that Chickasaws are both Republican and Democrat. So we just play the politics. It's just like naturally by default. I've got a Chickasaw-Choctaw joke that I'll tell later. But we're closely related. So the Choctaws were just south of us. But anyway, so the Spanish were there. And in the depths of winter, which isn't very ruddy awful in Mississippi, for Christ's sakes, we're up here, right? So this isn't the right audience to talk about the depths of winter of Mississippi, but we burned the village down, and that kind of like spoiled their party. And from there, Hernando de Soto had a really hard time and ended up dying of some stomach issue. You know, it's purely speculative. I imagine they didn't do a swab. But nonetheless, he didn't make it, and that's also like another historian's account or reference that account of where the wild hogs got out into the wild lands, and so in part of our Chickasaw culture, that we have that same kind of taboo or the associated you are what you eat, and that I think it's prevalent in most cultures. But one example would be if you eat deer, you're swift, and if you eat maybe a raccoon, you can climb a tree. Well, I don't know, but I wasn't there. But what I do know is it was written that we essentially didn't touch wild hogs for another couple hundred years, and so we did not eat the wild hogs or any of the cattle that were dispatched. And there's some culture. I should also mention I'm an ethnobotanist for the Chickasaw Nation, so kind of coming at y'all with an ethnobotanical perspective, so ethnography and history. So I've read a bunch of these texts, and a great deal of this is written by James Adair, and he wrote the History of American Indians, and he was one of the first to write extensively about the southeastern tribes, and so we really are talking in the Mississippi River Valley. Just a little more context. That one of the cultural practices was we would place the young the newborn boys on a cougar pelt, and the newborn girls were placed on a female deer's pelt for gentleness, and there was taboos against touching moles and things like that. So there was a belief, a cultural practice that you could embolden the spirit of an animal by eating it or touching it. And so I tell people that I must eat a lot of bear, but but we ate a lot of things. So we don't think about, when we talk about the historical meat consumption of American Indians, we leave out things like bear, and that there was woodland bison in the Mississippi River Valley. They weren't very predominant, like the bison that we think of in terms of the plains bison. I've eaten raccoon at my great grandmother's house. She's actually Choctaw. Well, she's dead, but there's that. She's no longer Choctaw. She was Choctaw. So I've ate raccoon, and we would show up there in Worcester, Oklahoma. It's on the eastern side of the state, and it's really it's the hill country. Instead of saying hillbilly, I'll say hill country. And there I said it, but. So we would show up, and she would give us 22s as young kids. I mean, I remember shooting a 22 before I learned how to read. I think that, anyways. And we would run out, and we would hunt squirrel. And so we'd gather a whole mess of squirrel, which I don't know what that numerically stands for, but as many as you can get, and make stew from squirrel. And raccoon was just something that I didn't even think twice about it as a kid. So I can appreciate the statement that there's that the poverty food, or that's what the ethnic people eat. It's delicious. That's why they eat it. But so we ate a whole multitude of organisms in the Mississippi River Valley. If you think about the migratory paths of all the birds, so we certainly would have eaten waterfowl, woodchuck. I have an ethnobotanical reference where there was and I don't know exactly what creature these things were, but they would gather up the tubers of a particular plant, and they would store them in their little dens, and so we would eat the animal and still their tubers, because we ate whatever was available, and we had plenty of crops, but you get sick of eating corn. So we would have been like one of the larger agrarian civilizations or tribes. Tribes is a diminutive term, and I think that's part of that rhetoric of trouble. We'll just leave it at that. We were the avid traders. We had a lot of crop production, and this isn't just the Chickasaws. It would be like about 70 tribes that would have been southeastern tribes that worked with one another. It wasn't like National Geographic boundaries where like Chickasaws were here and there was a border crossing where they engaged with. No, it was like it was engaging. And we intermarried, and there's no such thing as a full-blood anything in this world. It's ridiculous, except for maybe dogs, and then they're purebred. But we ate a lot of meat. We did, and whether or not it was, and we still do, like barbecue. There's some belief that there was some influence of the southeastern tribes working with well, we won't call them African Americans. At that point, they were slaves, and it's just a ruddy, awful piece of our history. But the American Indians and the slaves traded back and forth because the greedy white people only grew tobacco and sugarcane and things they could put on a boat to sell, right? I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So if you really just think about this as a scientist, we're all scientists to some degree or educated in here, and you read the historic text, you kind of get a little bit of insight into what was going on. But there is really some the ethnobotany of the African Americans, which was also called the ethnobotany of Negroes before they changed the title. But I like to just hit it raw. And they talked about they were the ones that were growing all the food, and they would and the owners encouraged it. They also talk about how the Americans were like the least bad slave owners. So that should make us all feel better. The British were awful, apparently. But anyways, so when you talk about meat consumption, and I am not keeping time. If somebody can, all right, you got me, because I don't do that. I'm terrible at keeping time. All right, and you may have to do like this because I got like lights in my eye. But when you think about let's well, I had some notes because I talk in tangents, and I apologize for that. But okay, so I got Washington Irving is on the list. So we'll just go ahead and hit that. So Washington Irving had a pretty, and it's a nice segue into the modernity of American Indian meat consumption. traditional versus cultural. I'm going to go ahead and nail that concept right now before I forget. So it's very traditional for us to consume meat. It's very ancestral for a Plains Indian to eat buffalo, or a Chickasaw to eat redfish out of the Mississippi River, and that's all I'll say about that. But so Washington Irving wrote Tour of the Prairie. It's a lovely read, and I'm a little sentimental because I'm an Oklahoman. But he had come through the Creek Fort, and I forget the name of the fort. It's irrelevant right now. But he had a team of dragoons, which I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I think it's like a military group. So it was like a lot of military folks, and there was like 300 of them, and they traversed through the cross timbers, which was also called the cast iron forest at that time, and it's kind of where the cross timbers got its name. And so that's an ecoregion that just falls below the bur oak savannas that y'all know to the west of here. And I've spent some time at the long-term ecological research station. I think it's Cedar Creek, if anybody knows that in here. And yeah, it was pretty groovy. Ate some of the potato bread and fed mosquitoes for 2 weeks. That's pretty much what I remember, like clouds of mosquitoes chasing you from the tent to the mess hall. And I had to like poison myself with DEET. But anyways, that's not what the talk's about. So Washington Irving had went across and wrote about the abundancy of game, and and how the American Indians were and I think it was in that read. It's been some time ago, but there was definitely it was definitely acknowledged that we were altering the woodlands, and we were burning the prairies. And so it's a concept that I like to call passive husbandry. And it's something that we would all do if we could do it. I mean, why the heck would we pin them up when we can just kind of like modify the forested areas and burn the grass, and you get bigger, nicer, more abundant game. And when there was a lot less of us, it made a lot of sense. And then we had these hunting parties and different techniques. And so like it would be akin to the prehistoric running the buffaloes off of the cliff, only a lot more sustainable. So we would have like maybe correlated a forest fire with like a side-by-side hunt that you would go through and harvest what you needed. So Washington Irving's Tour of a Prairie is going to give you some insight into the abundancy of game and the amount of meat that was consumed. And this wasn't too terribly long ago, so it would have been maybe 1820s, 1830s, like around the time of statehood of Oklahoma, before 18 teens, I forget the exact date, but prior to Washington Irving, we had Lewis and Clark, and they took exquisite notes about the abundancy of game and how every day they would get moose and elk and deer and all kinds of things, enough to feed all their guys and animals and whatever they brought along. So we know that there was an abundancy of game, and that like it's delicious when you roast it, and so we clearly ate a lot of meat. I know that there's some modern issues with grinding up the bones of my ancestors and to figure out exactly what they ate, because that would be like, we could really just go straight to it, wouldn't we? But we're trying to avoid that. So a lot of it's speculative, but we know from the notes that we probably did eat a lot of game. Well, in modern times, if you think about a Siouan, since we're up in Siouan country, and I'm probably mucking that up because I'm just a ruddy southeasterner, but the folks that have the same heritage as the Shakopees and the other tribes up here, but in South Dakota, because I know a bunch of people in the Great Plains, they do massive cattle productions. And so what was meat to American Indians? It was a way of like making a living. And so like now they're making a living with cattle. And so cattle production is really huge in American Indian country when you get out to the west. And so it's associated with, it was a huge contradiction, because I'm kind of a hippie and like grow vegetables, and I got out into this Indian world, and it's like cowboys, but they're Indians, and I didn't really understand, but now I do, I get it. Because it's that lifestyle, and so the buffalo were gone, and they had all the grass, and when you have grass, you feed it to an ungulate I think I said that wrong, but and there's definitely environmental consequences and various things, and some Plains Indians grow buffalo and think that they should only eat buffalo, and that's fine. They should probably just stick to that. But the meat has always been part of our culture. The thing that we don't talk about is the abundancy of fish and all the fisheries that were altered and destroyed. Our concept of the environment is so off and speculative. Like, I'm even going to speculate right now, but we're operating with just a few % of the wetlands that we had prior to the colonization. So, and even in the last few hundred years, where we had like the industrial revolution on, things went really fast, and so we dredged the swamps. We got rid of channelized the streams. We radically altered the grasslands to forest ratios. We killed off and extirpated entire species of animals in the process, and their food going along. So one good example of that that's extensively written about is the Arundinaria gigantea, or the river cane. They talked about miles wide by 12 miles long cane thickets in the entire Mississippi River basin, and how that was a habitat for various animals, and that the cattle would eat the shoots of it. It's edible, kind of like if you've ever had bamboo shoots. They're pretty good when they're small, and so the cattle would go in and graze them out. So we've extirpated like food sources and changed and altered habitats and the climate. If you think of places like Oklahoma, we dammed up all the rivers, and now the humidity's higher than it ever was. It's like right at the southern extent of the Great Plains. Everything is different. We've radically altered this country, and now we're all of us. How many people have a farm and grow their food in here? Not very many people. Yeah. And to grow all of our food, because I have a little farm and I grow a lot of food, and I trade and barter with other farmers and do consulting and usually end up with stuff. But to really, the lifestyle and within the modernity of it all, like the growing our own food, we wouldn't have time for it. So you kind of get into this concept of like poor dirt farmer and the cycle of pain with the reliance on petrochemicals and the subsidies and all these things. So have y'all ever noticed the easiest way to tell the difference between a farmer and a rancher? Is that it's by the brim of their hat. So cowboys wear cowboy hats, ranchers wear, and farmers' hats fit perfectly into a mailbox. It's like to look for the subsidy check. It's like it's a bad joke. I just had to throw it in there because I knew y'all could appreciate it up here. How are we doing on time?
Like 5-10 minutes.
I may have 5 or 10 minutes in me. All right, we'll keep going. So when you look at the diversity of the tribes, so we're up here and we're going to have it's best to look at them in terms of like linguistic groups. So I'm Muskogean, so I'm more closely related to the Creek and the Choctaw. And the Cherokee's a little off, but that's a whole southeasterner thing. Whereas the Siouxan tribes are going to have a lot more in common, and they're going to have more in common with the offshoots of that language group, like the Osage, than a southeastern tribe. And so as an ethnographer, and especially as an ethnobotanist, you'll notice the cultural practices are going to be pretty conservative within those language groups. And so when we get into the Southwest, as we heard earlier, it's radically different there, and the growing conditions are different. When we get up into the Northwest, for example, there wasn't a lot of cultivation, as we would call it. It was more like passive cultivation, so where they would modify their natural environment to encourage the growth of food plants with fire or with damming areas. They principally were fishermen, and so they had a lot. That was their primary. They subsided on things from the ocean, and supplemented it with things that they would wild harvest, you could say. But it was much more than that. It was like a permaculture. They were the first permaculturists, essentially. And this is no different than the Europeans' history. If you really go back, like we were all very human being in the beginning, and now we're something else. I don't know, but part of the machine, right? but we were all more one with the environment, and so we would have altered the forest to our benefit. The one thing that kicks me about ecology is that we're not viewed as a keystone species, even though we are the keystone species. But maybe it's because keystone species hold ecological groups together. We're the anti-keystone species. I don't know, but we had a large influence on the natural populations, and when there was much less of us, things were a lot more copacetic with the environment. But it doesn't mean that we didn't cut down trees and alter things. So there's a couple of things that the Choctaw joke. So before I forget, so the Choctaw, they're not as lucrative, or wait, we're being filmed. No, it's okay. They'll like this joke too. So I tell people that I think I may be more Choctaw than Chickasaw because I'm not as good with my money, and the Chickasaws are really good with their money, but we lost context. It's no longer funny. So we'll just move on, but. There are a lot of really interesting examples that together make up the bigger picture, and so we didn't completely disregard all European things. One example of that would be the peach. So when the Spanish introduced the peach, you're going to see a wild spread across the continent with peaches. The tomato, as your ethnobotanist, I know all about that. Somebody was mentioning tomatoes. The Europeans didn't touch them until most recently. They were referred to as wolf peaches. So it was like American presidents that convinced them to be grown predominantly. And potato has a really cool history. So as the Europeans interacted, because not all Europeans were, like in the club. Like just because you were white doesn't mean that you were like, one of the Americans. No, the Americans had their own like prejudice early on. And so like the Irish and the Scottish and other groups, like ethnic groups, got pushed down there. We pushed the Germans to the north. No. I thought you had a question. No, I'm kidding. It's telling me my time's almost up, so I'll wrap it up. We had these ethnic communities that are often associated with particular tribes, and so the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and the French, the Chickasaws. As we got into Oklahoma, that's where we kind of really mixed it up with the Scottish and the Irish and the Cherokees too. We had interestingly, the Choctaws sent a ship of potatoes over to Ireland and sent their potatoes back over to them. And there's a giant monument honoring the Choctaws for sending the potatoes after the potato famine, which is pretty cool. Y'all can look it up. Double check me. But so was that the 5-minute mark?
Yeah, or just final remarks.
All right, final remarks. Now y'all know as much as me, and but hopefully what you got out of this was that we don't know how many pounds of meat was consumed by any particular group, and there was well over 500 tribes depending on how you count them, and there was a lot of tribes, and they all had radically different habits, eating habits, cultural practices, and if you really want to lump them up, because we're scientists in here, right? And we're doing research and we're trying to see norms and practices. We're going to use the linguistic groups. So the Muskogean speaking tribes are going to be a lot more similar, and just use your head. If they've been in that area together, or if they've been like moved away in various states, there's going to be radical differences. And like all tribes in Oklahoma eat barbecue. Every meeting I've ever been to, like any conference, like it's always barbecue for lunch. So we know that for sure. So it's an affirmative. We eat meat in Oklahoma. And I've got opinions about grass finish for the next talk. Do we have any questions? I'll just field questions from here. Wow. We got a question? Just speak up because I can't hear you from here. Oh. You want to form a question? You're on the spot now. No? All right. Any questions? It can be like food safety, biosystems agriculture engineering. I think I can do ethnobotany. Chickasaw versus Choctaw. No? Oh.
Yeah, I've got a question for Stephen. So are there Native American communities that have ancestrally not eaten meat, that have been primarily plants?
Yeah, I am not aware of any cultural group that didn't eat meat because they decided to be vegetarian. Yeah, I don't, if anyone knows anything of that. I mean, I know that Hindi, you know, there's some examples maybe in India, but I think in many instances it's group by group within that country. But there's very few examples of, as your ethnobotanist, of examples of cultures that didn't eat meat because they didn't want to eat meat.
But in lots of cultures, meat is it's eaten in small amounts.
Yeah, and there was certainly Native American groups that ate in small amounts. And if you think about, like, when you get into the Pueblos, the Hopi, Arizona, the Highland Plateaus, there wouldn't have been as abundant meat sources. Resources were just highly limited. And there's some pretty interesting cultural practices that tie into that. So, like, if you were Hopi and you were of a particular clan, you could only go this direction away from the village site to hunt and gather. You couldn't go this way or this way or this way. So there was like clan paths and destinations. And so the abundancy wasn't there. And there was long stretches between tribes. And they have a lot of vegetable culture. They once ate 7-year corn because of the drought cycles. But yeah, if you look at most of their dishes, that's not a bunch of meat. Whereas, like, if you get into the southeastern tribes, where we had an abundancy of meat, like, we deep fried cubed meat at ours. Like, I'm serious, at our cultural gatherings. You just take pork and you chop it up and you fry it in lard, and there's just meat at every meal. And the Plains Indians are heavy meat consumers. They always have been. So there was just less vegetable, little to no cultivation. So cultivation was kind of a secondary thing for the Plains tribes, where they were chasing the herd, you know, and hunting. They would plot, they would do garden plots along the way, but they weren't principally vegetable producers. And if you get up into the Northeast, so one thing I didn't mention earlier was that the crops are different. So if you think about, like, the corn that we're eating, was really high in protein. So the corn that the Hopi were eating, you know, satisfied a lot of their nutritional needs, and they used traditional processing to make those amino acids available. And I beat that drum all the time, and forget to mention it in a talk. But next time I'll use a PowerPoint, like bulleted points, right? But yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
In this gradient of people eating more meat, some groups eating less, are we aware of any diseases, any conditions that were linked to the diet, or any big deficiencies, differences in life expectancy in these groups?
Okay, I'll repeat the question because I've got the microphone. So since we did have the different linguistic groups and the different environmental conditions and the different meat consumption rates, do we know of any difference in the quality of their lives or life expectancy or anything? And I think we got to grind up the bones. I mean, and I'm not opposed to that as a scientist, but don't tell anybody. But that's, you know, that's something. Nobody wants their ancestors dug up and ground up into powder and ran through a laboratory process. So I think that in general, there's probably some observations that we can make from, like, teeth and different, like maybe like a distance of femurs and height. And I would imagine we do. I have no idea. The answer is I don't know. I have no idea. But I bet there's information. Sounds like a good EBSCO host search. Yeah. And so our variation is called tomfala, but yeah, I make sofki all the time. So yeah, at home I've got the traditional. It's called the titi, which could be mispronounced incorrectly.
Somebody was asking me if Native people ate fermented foods.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Tomfula is the, like Sofki. Yeah. No, that's. Yeah, so it's we use a dent corn. The Southeasterners could grow the longest season corn because we're, in Mississippi. And so whereas up here it would have been flint corn. It just wouldn't have the growing season. But now everybody grows everything. So we grew a lot of dent and flour corns in the Mississippi River Valley. And the dent corn in particular, we would soak it in lye. So oak ash lye is the most potent. And I just can't, I have to get my Chickasaw hat on. I forget the word for it. But we'd soak it in lye and then, leach that out. And you put it into like a mortar and pestle, but it wasn't for grinding. And it has a big hickory stump and slippery red elm base because it's antimicrobial. Anyways, I'm just like the I spared you the scientific names, but you lift it up and drop it, and it would slough off the pericarp or the outer skin of the kernel of corn, and then we would dry that. And store that into our grain storage, which were always above ground because it flooded, and animals. But that was then boiled, and a little bit of lye is added after it's cooked. And if you leave a lot of water in it to make tomfula or the sofki, and it tastes really good, like between like day 3 and day 7. And then it kind of tapers off and taste profile for me. Some people are like, the 12th day is the best, but I'm like 3.5. It's like pushing it. I've had it past that, and it's like stomach acid to me. It's my opinion. but we call, instead, tamales, we call them banaha. And we would take that same corn that's been treated with the lye and grind it into powder. Because the thing about a dent corn, which is one kind of corn, is you can kind of do a little anything with it. The flour corn's also good, but so flour corn's a shorter season. It may have been grown as far north this year, but dent corn is the best yield, and you get the most. And that's what we call feeder corn or deer corn now. And so it's going to be similar to our ancestral corns that we grew, but Bloody Butcher and Hickory King is probably as close to the Chickasaw or the Southeastern tribal corns that we've got. So you can buy that from Seed Savers or any of those outfits. Yeah, and we had a question here. I'm sorry, I just...
Oh, yeah, I was just going to ask if you were to recommend 1 or 2 texts or books to kind of gain knowledge similar to what you told us.
Yeah, James Adair, he has a thesis about how the Chickasaws were the lost tribe of Israel. And so that's interesting. And then the rest of it's about Southeastern tribes. But it's a historic text, and he was a spy for the crown. And so he was writing in detail, and he had a classical academic background, so it's a fun read. The ubiquitous American Indian reading, I would also recommend 1491, and then there's another book that's related to that, and it gives you some insight, especially into the Mesoamerica and what was happening there, and it talks about how the microorganisms associated with the cattle that were brought over laid waste to millions of people. And so the Spanish came in different groups. And so the first group, they reported the cities that would rival that of any city in Europe, and abundant food and diversity. And when they came back, they were like, everybody's dead in this jungle. So that's a really good read, and we're gaining more insight into that, exactly what happened. But it wasn't just the microorganisms associated with the animals, but we didn't give enough. So we had the smallpox and a few different things that laid waste, and then it was the animals that they left that continued to kill people. So through their poop. But it's all right. That's all I got.
Fascinating. So we're going to conclude today with a panel on the conversation on food health and colonization. We will be running a little past our 3:30 deadline. We'd be happy if you stayed, but if you have to leave, we understand. The second note is if all of our speakers, when it's over, would be willing to come up here, we're going to do a group photo for posterity's sake. So, and staff, yes, most important people. But now I'd like to introduce Dr. Craig Hassel, who is leading this next section, and he'll introduce the panel.
Thank you, Dan. Again, my name is Craig Hassel. I'm a colleague of Dan and Mindy's in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition. I want to thank Dan and Mindy and the Planning Committee for Healthy Foods, Healthy Lives for supporting this idea of a cultural take on some of these issues in food and health. And so we have a panel here today as part of the planning process. When Linda and Stephen were invited, I felt it was important for us to have a perspective from the indigenous culture here in the cities. And there's a lot of work going on around food sovereignty, dietary decolonization, and re-indigenizing our food system. And so we have a panel here that I'll introduce, and I'll ask them to talk briefly about what is going on here in the Twin Cities with respect to that work. So to my furthest to my left, or to my right, is Ryan Badheart Bull. Ryan is a registered dietitian. He's the first native RD produced by our department here at the University of Minnesota in dietetics. And he's a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe and has been practicing here as a registered dietitian for the past several years. Deanna Beaulieu. Deanna is a SNAP-Ed nutrition educator. She's been an urban resident here her entire life. She's been working as a SNAP-Ed nutrition educator with University of Minnesota Extension for the past 5 years. She's been doing a lot of great work in terms of the urban gardening work that's been going on, and she's busy right now working on urban perennial gardens and trying to recover some of the forest foods that were here hundreds of years ago. And so she's very well regarded in our urban community. And also Ernie Whiteman. Ernie was very gracious in terms of coming up from his wintering in Tucson, Arizona, and braving the elements. It's a shock for him as well, a thermal shock, but we're happy to have you here, Ernie. Ernie has his bachelor's in fine arts and his master's in fine arts from the University of Minnesota. Ernie is a very, very well-respected elder. He comes to us from the Arapaho community, and he's been working here in the Twin Cities community with Dream of Wild Health for the last 10 or 12 years. And he's done a lot of wonderful work with our youth. And so what I'll do is I'll just turn it over to Ernie first. I'll take the chair next to Ryan. And Ernie, please talk to us about some of the work that's going on with respect to dietary decolonization and re-indigenizing our food system.
Okay. Ithati nakasech dos hisse haba hena hinane dosi date bae Ithati. I introduced myself. I greeted everyone saying good day. We didn't have in my language a word saying good morning. We merely say that the sun is up now because every day is a good day, you know? So we have to remember that, even as cold as it is. And I'm Hinane. That's what we call
ourselves, my people, the Northern Arapaho. My name that was given to me is Date Ba'e, which means strong old man. When I was a child, I didn't understand that name. My brothers had names like Flying Eagle and Big Bear, very romantic names, you know? And mine was Strong Old Man. But that name has endured. I celebrated my 70th birthday this past February. So I feel that that name was well given, you know. And I'm from Heathity. That's the way we pronounce it. The English version is Ethity. Heathity means good. So I live in good, you know, and the sign language for that is good. Heathity. In Wyoming, on the Wind River Reservation. I'd like to thank everyone here today for attending. I'd like to thank the organization for having me here. It's always a pleasure to share with people. I don't know if I have enough time. I'm a storyteller and an orator and a teacher and an artist and a native. So I can talk for a long time, but I'll try to hold it down a little bit. I've been working with a program called Dream of Wild Health for over 10 years now. People say, well, why are you working with youth and why are you raising food? Because I like to eat and I like young people. It's that simple. No, not really, but one of the things about what we do is we have a 10-acre farm in Hugo, Minnesota. It's a native-run organization, Dream of Wild Health. We raise organic food, and we take kids, native kids from the metropolitan area of Minneapolis and St. Paul, take them to a 10-acre farm, and we teach them how to raise organic food, how to cook it, and I also teach the young people about their culture, teach art, whatever needs to be taught, I do it. And so one of the reasons why we do this is because of, we've talked about in depth today about colonization. And in order to recover, we have to decolonize. We have to decolonize our diet. The colonized don't realize they've been colonized too, you know? So part of that is we're trying to teach our people, our young people, how to eat healthy, how to live healthy, how to raise their food. We talk of sovereignty a lot today in the native tribes, and I think there's a lack of understanding about what sovereignty means, you know. It's supposed to be you're able to govern yourselves, to regulate yourselves, but to me, to be sovereign is to be able to feed yourself. How many of you in here could feed yourself if you had to, without going to a grocery store? Anybody in here? Yes, there's a few people, okay. So that's one of the things that, to me, sovereignty means the ability to feed yourself, to feed your family, to feed your people. So if we are truly sovereign, then we can feed our people. We can go back to the original foods of the people. Organic farming is nothing new to Native people. We were the first organic farmers here on this continent. We were colonized. So the methods of farming were taken from us, the land was taken, and we were taught new methods of farming, new ways to raise food, new diets. One of the most detrimental things to Native people was rations. The government gave us lard, flour, and sugar. These were foods that were not part of our diet. If you think about it, colonization had our people do a complete turnaround. Complete turnaround. Think about that. Your land is invaded, your land is taken, many of you are killed, many of you are removed to new places. You have no place to go, even in your own land. You're introduced to a new food. Your diet that once existed no longer exists. We talk about beef today. You know, I've heard a lot of conversation about beef today. And we don't eat beef on the farm. We eat buffalo. Buffalo, venison, turkey, fish. These are part of the foods that we're reintroducing back to our young people. They do farmers markets. We take food into the communities, the native communities. Cooking is a very important part of what we do. You know, what good is it if you have all this food if you can't cook it? You know? It turns blue in your refrigerator, then starts to grow, and, you know, it's got its own life. Yeah? So we have to cook this food. We have to learn to cook it. We're a very spiritually based organization, and that's my role. Each day I begin with a prayer in a circle with the young people. Because in our culture, the concept of the circle is what we all live in. The animals live in the circle. The plants are in the circle. It only makes sense to have that concept of the circle. The earth is a sphere. It's a circle. It rotates in a circle. The moon is in a circle. Your DNA is in a circle. I remember when I first attended college, I went home and one of the elders says, "Well, what are you doing now?" I said, "Well, I'm going to school. I'm going to college." He said, "You're in the square culture now." I said, "What do you mean by the square culture?" He said, "Well, when you fly in an airplane, you look down, what do you see? The land is all in squares. You go into a town, when you land, they all live in square blocks. Their houses are square. Their doors are square. Their windows are square. Even the books they read are square." He said, "So don't forget. Don't forget where you come from, and don't forget about your culture. We come from a circle. We live within that circle. We are unified with everything in that circle. The plants, the animals, the people, everything. The land, the water, the air." So this is what we try to do with the young people. We try to incorporate all the ancient teachings of our people, reintroducing them to these concepts and these ideas. We're very fortunate because we were gifted seeds from an elder by the name of Cora Baker. Cora Baker spent her lifetime seed saving. She has seeds from all over the United States, from every tribe. We are the seed savers from a lot of these tribes. We have a lot of their seeds. So we have to be very careful when we raise these seeds because of the monoculture that exists around us, the GMO. And we can only raise so many of these seeds a year. Some of the seeds that we raise are the sacred seeds of our people, the tobacco. I raise a sacred tobacco that's over 900 years old. We raise sage, sweetgrass, and cedar. These are the 4 sacred plants of our people. We use them in the ceremonies. We use them for prayers. And so our kids, when they come to the farm, they're able to grow these things. They're able to grow not only their food, but their medicines. We forage. We go into the woods. We teach them how to forage. We went wild ricing last year. We go berry picking. So we're getting back to a lot of the ways of our people, a lot of the ways that our people once existed. And so the diet is very important because diabetes and heart disease is rampant in our communities. It's because of the introduction of the diet that we never had before. I'm a plains person, and we ate a lot of buffalo. In Wyoming, where I come from, I was raised on a ranch. My people were ranchers, and we raised beef cattle. And that replaced the buffalo. Now, if any of you are from out west, oil and cattle are what keeps Wyoming, Montana, a lot of those western states alive. Yellowstone Park has the last herd of buffalo. The original buffalo of this continent are in Yellowstone Park. Now these buffalo wander off in the wintertime to feed, and they're slaughtered. They're literally killed by the ranchers. They protect the elk, but they don't protect the buffalo. So the buffalo are still being slaughtered. At one time, it was to kill the food source of the people. Now, if you can control a people through their food, you don't need weapons. Isn't that right? I see a trend happening today in this country of food control. Corporations, the casinos, the hospitals, the prisons, they all are into this. They buy from the corporations. Cisco, they sign a contract. You break that contract, we sue you. On my reservation, we have a ranch called the Arapaho Ranch. We raise beef cattle and registered horses. Well, we had a forest fire. We had to cut down on our beef cattle, so we decided to go organic. We are now the largest producers of organic beef in Wyoming, which is not hard to do because nobody's raising organic beef. Everybody's shooting their cattle full of hormones trying to get it to market. So I go to the casino when I'm home, and I go to the restaurant, and they're offering organic beef. Good, I'm gonna try some of the steak. I order an organic steak. It was the best steak I had. A year later, I go back. I want one of them organic steaks. Well, we don't sell them here anymore. I said, what happened? Well, people were complaining it was too gamey. That's what we were told to tell the people. I found out that the tribe had signed a contract with Cisco. They couldn't even sell their own beef at their own casino, or they would be sued. So is that food control? It certainly is. I know another Native person that was going to sell coffee to the casinos. He was all hooked up with the brothers in South America to avoid the middleman that he was going to sell coffee to the casinos. He started with the Shakopee tribe. They said, no, we already have a distributor. He went to every casino in the state, and none of them would buy his coffee because they all had signed a contract. And even with Indian preference, he could not sell his coffee at an Indian casino, being Native, because the food companies, the food corporations had gotten a hold of him. So we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of what's going on in the food industry today. It happened to us as Native people. It happened to us, I know. I know from experience what happens when you control the food of the people. So we have to be very careful, be cautious. On a lighter note, you know, we as Native people from various places have always eaten meat. You know, meat has been part of our diet, but it was not beef or pork. I know of virtually no one in my tribe that was a person that ate a lot of deer that had heart disease. We never heard of heart disease until red meat from the cattle was introduced to us. So, you know, the beef industry, like I said, is very powerful in this country. It's like the oil industry. I was in resources when I was very young. So I know about the oil and the uranium. And so in the West, like I said, oil and cattle run the Western states. And so it's very big. You go out there and you can't go into a restaurant without eating meat, you know? It's one of the things that plagues us is the red meat. But I like to think that by teaching and educating the young people about these things, I'm also a historian of Indian history, Indian art history. I can relate to them from a historical context of what has happened and where we're going. You know, you must know where you come from. You have to know about the history of the past so you won't make the same mistakes in the future. So we have to all be aware of these things, not just Native people, everyone, or we'll be making the same mistakes again. So I think that I better pass this on because we have two other people here. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Deanna Beaulieu. I work at the University Extension. I'm a SNAP Ed educator. What that means is I work primarily in the Native communities in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I create, a big part of my job is creating partnerships and building relationships within the community to increase capacity for food accessibility and affordability for low-income communities, which are our primary demographic for SNAP Ed recipients. And SNAP is it's the Supplemental Nutrition Education Program. When I was growing up, it was called AFDC, and then it was the food stamp program for the for communities. But yeah, I was raised in Minneapolis. I was born at HCMC, and I was raised in the Phillips community. I started here working at the University of Minnesota 5 years ago, almost 5 years in May. I'm coming up on my anniversary. But before then, I wasn't in food work. I was had a lot of different interests. I used to sell leases, so I may have shown you guys an apartment or two. I have my education career has been more or less a process of elimination. I found a lot of things that I didn't want to do. And then finally, when I decided to be more pragmatic and get a job, I found community health work. It kind of happened to me. I didn't go out looking for it, but I started at the Native American Community Clinic, where I learned firsthand of the real day-to-day life socioeconomic barriers that people in my community are up against, and how that affects our hierarchy of needs, where our basic needs aren't being met, where we can't really focus on being more proactive in our communities by having preventative measures from getting sick and making healthy food choices. It becomes more or less like, we don't know where our next our next meal is coming from. I don't know how I'm going to feed my kids. So any food is good food. So I started asking these kind of questions: where are we as communities putting the value? I should kind of. So when I was working at NAC, the Native American Community Clinic, I worked primarily in cancer education and outreach, and getting people screened for cervical cancers and colorectal cancers and what's the other one? Mammograms. These ones. These cancers. So primarily I was talking to women, and women are in our communities, especially in an urban area, we are the ones that are the caretakers of families. We raise the children, we take care of the elders, we have a lot of responsibility, and we are the decision makers of food and other, I should say everything, because as a younger Native woman, I decide what's good. So I noticed that the grant-funded program that we had, we were able to buy gift cards. And so every time a woman got a pap smear or a mammogram or a colorectal screening, I was able to give them a $10 gift card. And to me, I thought that was doing something good. Like, come and then, there's a little perk at the end and you can come back. But then I was noticing that these screenings are only once a year or once every 3 or 5 years. But I had women coming back every time we would screen and be like, oh, can I get another mammogram? And I was like, well, no. Then I noticed that we were putting the value, they wanted the $10 gift card. And I noticed that it was because those gift cards are a way that people are able to make ends meet. And then it kind of became more of like, well, where are we as community putting the value of, are we putting the value on the screening or the education or the reason why it's a good thing to do something, and we're actually investing in the value of keeping these people hand to mouth and needing that handout. So that was something that became apparent to me at that point, and it also speaks to a historical trauma and oppression. When you live in communities that are oppressed communities, and there's lateral violence, lateral oppression, a lot of gang violence, and these things are all you really know, how are you going to be able to make better decisions if your socioeconomic barriers are so prevalent? And your environment actually dictates your behavior, and it's not the other way around, where the decisions that you make are shaping your perspective. Whereas there's a shooting in the community, and now everyone has to come together for some other reason. So we're really reactive communities and action from crisis communities. And I feel like when I talk to people about food, because that's essentially all I do, as I do direct nutrition education, so part of that relationship building with partners is scheduling classes and getting community into a space where they can learn practical shopping, cooking skills, so that they're making a healthy choice, the easy choice. That's our tagline, so I try to use it as much as possible. So I think one of the things that's the biggest is a perceived barrier of not having being empowered to make your own healthy food choices is a huge detriment to our communities, because there's a lot of perceived reasons why we can't. And So building up the networks is really good. I partner with food shelves to provide accessibility and affordability for communities to have access to healthy foods. I try to do as much nutrition education as possible to increase the efforts. And I would like to move a little bit more into teaching people to teach others is kind of a way to do it. I don't want to call it building an army or having minions, because I do have plans to be an evil overlord at some point. I do kind of want to sit in a chair and like pet a cat and tell people what to do, and like a little bit of a Red Queen where it's off with their head kind of situation, which would be nice, but it's not realistic. But yeah, so I really look at the big picture of food systems in an urban setting and working with each demographic of communities where I'm engaging with elders and trying to help, trying to, for lack of a better word, harness their wisdom of what it was like for them growing up before they're gone. And then there's, a wealth of 100 years of, traditional knowledge that goes along with them. And then working with young kids and getting kids into wanting to eat healthy and traditional foods, and maternal child health is another one. Breastfeeding is another area that's really important. A lot of our young women having babies don't breastfeed, and that's a big area of concern when we're talking about like maternal child health issues. Introducing traditional foods earlier is important. So there's a lot of areas where there can be a lot of improvement around accessibility to traditional foods. We primarily eat a colonized diet, Western diet, especially living in an urban community. Most places that we get food are grocery stores. So I also am part of a garden, the Mashkaki Gitugan. It's an Ojibwe word for, it means medicine garden, is the translation. And it's we're working to create a space in an urban setting where we're able to practice traditional knowledge, cultural practice teachings of growing food. Like Ernie with his tobacco medicines, and how can we create a space so that he can share his knowledge with other young men in our communities. And then, yeah, we're shifting a lot in that space. We have 3 sites now where we used to have 1 or 2, and now we have 3. And when Craig mentioned the food forests, the perennial forests, we do have 1 site that we're planning to incorporate some more perennial foods. So that's really good. So those foods will be there every year, and instead of having to find seeds and plants every year to grow. So that's a really good effort, and we're actually looking at having more of a strategic plan this year with engaging more youth, which is good. Some of the youth from the Dream Wild Health Farm, that's an awesome program, the Garden Warriors program. My daughter is a chorus kid. She'll be 12 this year, or she is 12, so this year is her last year as the chorus kid in the chorus kids, so she'll be a Garden Warrior next year. But what I would like to do, or what I would like to see, is like having an urban site, so kids who can't get up to the farm can do the same kind of thing in their own backyards. So that's another piece of that youth engagement and community engagement strategy, so that we're not having to vie for the same kind of grants. We're trying to create economic stability within the community, so we're able to make it easier for people to eat healthier, essentially. I think that's about it. I mean, there's a lot, like you said, too. Like, I could go on and on and on, and yeah, but I won't.
Thank you, Dee.
Yeah, thanks.
My name is Ryan Badheart, and I'm a recent graduate of the University of Minnesota. I became a registered dietitian, actually through the University of Minnesota's dietetic internship, the class of 2015, actually. So I've been practicing for a couple years now, and I'd like to say thank you, first of all, to Dan Gallagher. He was one of my professors, and I have to give him credit for helping to get my vitamin D levels up. Because I took a class and realized I was low, and started supplementing, and lo and behold, felt better. So thanks, Dan. But, you know, I didn't come here with any sort of agenda. I was just asked to I kind of wanted to just share a little bit about my story, kind of what I went through, because I come from Rapid City, South Dakota, which is a predominantly white town in western South Dakota near the Black Hills. And near there is a reservation called Pine Ridge. It's actually the lowest county in, the lowest county. It's the poorest county in America. Unfortunately, every time I go back, which is about yearly, maybe biannually, it's always a mixed bag, because you feel a strong sense of pride to see your people and to be around your family, but it's also very painful to see the living conditions on the reservation. I originally moved here roughly over 10 years ago, to pursue a degree in pursue an education in nutrition. But there were some issues I had to resolve kind of in my personal life, and so I kind of waited to go back to school. I was in my mid-20s when I kind of just started all over. And I realized I always struggled with school growing up. A big factor of that was a strong sense of isolation, because the schools I went to were predominantly white. I was one of maybe 4 or 5 Native kids in kindergarten through 6th grade and continuing on. And, to be honest with you, growing up, I felt a strong sense of shame about being a Native person. I dealt with a lot of racism growing up, particularly in junior high and high school, and I got my fair share of names and, bullying and all that. So, as I came out of high school and became an adult, I knew I went through some turmoil, but I realized that nutrition was something that I was passionate about and something maybe I could tie in to the Native community and help some way, somehow. Now, the plan was always to try to become a dietitian, gain the knowledge, gain the experience, take it back to the reservation, and hopefully help along the way. I don't want to say unfortunately, but I would say over the past year or so, I've just been going through a lot of inner turmoil regarding kind of things I alluded to earlier, just the living conditions on the reservation, and realizing that there's so many other issues that need to be addressed prior to the nutrition piece. So it can be overwhelming at times. The good thing is that I'm not alone in my struggle, and sometimes I can feel that way, especially the position I'm in now. I'm the only Native there, and it's a fairly large facility. I typically go through my day hoping that I run into another Native person kind of randomly, because it's so rare that I ever see any. That being said, there are other Native people doing a lot of good work, such as these people here. And by working with them, I found that that's how I'm able to kind of retain my hope for our future. I found that, I'm very much in the grind of life right now. I'm very much working a lot. I don't have much time for social activity or personal things, and that's fine. However, that being said, the more time I spend away from my community, the more I feel like I'm losing touch with my culture and everything that makes me a Native person. I'm telling you this because I don't know where this is heading, where this is going, how it's going to affect me. I'm currently in the process of trying to examine that. I've been working with Dr. Hassel here, who's been gracious enough to invite me to kind of work together to kind of expose some of the obstacles I faced growing up, being Native in an all-white community in an all-white school, thinking a lot about what did I have to hold back or let go of, or hold within, so that I may benefit from the system that I found myself in. And I continue to struggle with that. I think all ethnic minority groups struggle with that to a certain extent. And I'm no different. It's just that I'm a Native man, you know, and I have my own story. We all have our own. So that being said, I suppose if there's anything I'd like to contribute to this, it's just the fact that I found that there has been a strong sense of support from all communities, from all areas I've encompassed. And I'd say, despite the isolation that I might feel, I feel a strong sense of pride for moments like this when I feel like are making steps towards progress. There's so much work to do, and like I said, it can feel very overwhelming at times. And so it is a one day at a time kind of approach that I find works best for me. So at the moment, it's just kind of a matter of determining how am I gonna kind of gain more for myself so that I can contribute to my community. I don't know. So that's where I'm at, and I'm hoping to gain more as I do more events like this and communicate with people like Ernie, Deanna, and Craig. So thank you.
Being the elder here, I'd like to thank these two young people here for coming up and being able to speak to the audience today and share. You know, sometimes it's very hard to share things from your heart, you know, and I think it's very good that they could come here today and share a lot with the audience today. So I want to thank the both of you for being here. You know, I forgot to mention, Deanna mentioned that we have two programs with our youth. Cora's Kids, which is for children from 8 to 13. And then we have the Garden Warriors, who are 14 to 17 years of age. About 2 years ago, a contest was held here in the Twin Cities area for the organization Roots, for what is the name of that? Roots for the Home Team, thank you. And they asked young kids in organizations to compete in this contest in making a salad. So our warriors entered the contest and came up with this salad with wild rice and blueberries and won the contest and won $5,000. But the big thing is they sell this salad at the Twins game. Have any of you ever been there to the Twins game? That's probably the only healthy food that you will find there is this salad from the Garden Warriors. So that's one of the things that really makes me feel good is when I see the young people accomplish something like this, you know, and go out and do something. So I just had to mention that. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our panelists, and I think we're probably over time significantly at this point. So I want to thank you all for your patience and bearing with us, and wish you the best in terms of dealing with that wind out there. Thank you all.